Hello, this is Kingston Kids Story Time. I am Father Gary, and I am the priest at Kingston Episcopal Parish, which is in Matthews, Virginia, in the Diocese of Virginia. And I welcome all of you kids who have gathered to hear this story today, and especially our Kingston kids. Uh, I want to welcome Carter and Lyman and Luke and Paige, Ryan and Lane, Eloise, Cooper, Kennedy, Kara, Kate, Lauren, Izzy, Sammy, and Ashley. But I also want to welcome any of the rest of you. Welcome. I'm going to read a story today about the Goombagawatsa. Now, you may not have ever heard about the Goombagawatsa before, but the Goombagawatsa first visited my family and my four boys when we were going through a difficult time. And I would tell the boys stories about the Goombagawatsa. And we're going to spend some time, I hope, telling stories about the Goombagawatsa here too. But I'm going to start with a little introduction about the Goombagawatsa in this story. And it's a story, so it's got some other people in it and some other things going on. But it's about the Goombagawatsa that eventually will be something that I hope each of you will get to know very well. I hope you'll get to know the Goombagawatsa. All right, here's the story. The clock glowingly said 1:77 a.m., which would have been strange enough in itself, but was especially surprising because the electricity had been knocked out by the storm. The lightning seemed to be flashing down more on than off, like a spastic strobe light on overload. But what had awakened Kester was the thunder. It rolled and boomed so loudly and constantly that his bed moved beneath him. His heart was racing. He had never heard thunder like this. At first he tried to count between the lightning and the thunder, but it was too hard to guess which rumbling boom went with which blast of light. It all blurred together into something that, in his half-wakefulness, was both beautiful and terrifying. And then it happened. It was thunder, he was pretty sure. But this didn't sound like the other thunder. As a matter of fact, it wasn't so much what it sounded like as what it felt like that got Kester's attention. He thought the sky must have opened up right outside his window. For a moment, his breath seemed vacuumed right out of him, and then it exploded back in again like a punch to his solar plexus. It was like a sonic boom, maybe. Only the airplane that broke the sound barrier was somehow just 6 feet away and perhaps breaking the speed of light, too, since the flash seemed to come after the sound and light up the room so brightly that it hurt his eyes. And he could still see it when he closed them to the hurt. Kester sat still in his bed, stunned for a minute or so. And then he got up and went to his dad's room. His dad was awake too. That was a big one, wasn't it? He was at the window looking out to make sure no trees were on fire in the yard. He looked relieved to see Kester. Rob, Kester's older brother by 2 years at 14, was already sitting cross-legged at the foot of Dad's bed. After that, the lightning and thunder seemed to calm down into something more normal for a storm. It didn't stop, not until nearly dawn, but it gave some space and distance to the three tired ones, which allowed them to drift off to sleep again. As Kester fell into his dreams, he heard himself say in his head, "What has happened?" Somehow that boom had been more than just the crescendo of the storm. Somehow it brought change with it. Change that he couldn't quite dream into his imagination yet, or understand. There had already been so much change recently. Kester and Rob had seen their parents' marriage end in divorce. And while nobody thought that the marriage could have continued, nobody really knew what to make of this ending either. It was hard and sad, and life just hadn't quite gotten back on track since. So as he slept on this change, Kester had a strange knot of hope and dread tie itself up inside of him. When he awoke, he walked to the bathroom and heard himself say again in his head, "Dear God, please make this a good change this time." He wasn't prone to praying, actually. He had given that up a few years ago, maybe about the time he realized something wasn't good about his parents' marriage and his family was going to break. But his prayers stuck anyway. In the bathroom with the door closed, he allowed himself to whisper out loud, "Dear God, please make this a good change this time." Kester, Rob, and Dad were all a bit worn out the next morning. Luckily, it was Saturday and nobody had any place they had to go. So Dad made his Saturday special breakfast, eggs and bacon and homemade biscuits. The biscuits were the best part. The coffee was good too, and the boys had begun to drink that in recent times, since the divorce, as a sort of sign of their growing up, whether they wanted to or not. And actually, they both liked the coffee, just not the rest of it. After breakfast, Rob took the coffee grounds and the eggshells out to the compost pile on the other side of the garage, away from the kitchen. Dad had recently turned the compost, so it looked mostly like good, dark earth. The only signs that it was still a working pile were a recent orange peel and a loaf of bread that had become a science project, green with mold before they could eat it. As he dumped the breakfast remains on top, he smelled something. And it wasn't particularly unusual to smell something at the compost pile, but this smelled like something was burning. Out beyond the first trees that surrounded the backyard, there was a light gray smoke rising from behind the large tulip poplar tree. The old tree was special to Kester and Rob and Dad. It was so big around near the base that all three of them could reach around and try to grab each other's hands and not touch. Dad called the tree Old Grandmother. And for whatever reason, every now and then when they were out back, they would try to reach around her again, like she might have gone on a diet and tightened her waist. Or maybe they thought that as the boys grew, the boys were growing, their arms would make up the difference. Then again, maybe they hugged around Old Grandmother just to assure themselves that there was something so wonderfully big and old in the world that they couldn't quite hold on to it. Rob started to go out to the tree to see what was smoking, but then he stopped and decided he'd get Dad first. Dad had finished cleaning up in the kitchen and was in the shower, so Rob went to Kester and said, "Something is smoldering in the backyard near old grandmother. I hope she's okay. Maybe that big crack of thunder hit her." Kester was up and out the door. Rob followed behind. Near the roots of old grandmother was something that looked like an old suitcase at the end of a gash in the earth that went about 25 feet through the woods. The thing was black, but whether from being burnt or just black to begin with, it was hard to tell. Kester walked over and touched it tentatively. It was warm, but not too hot. It still smelled smoky, and there was a vague trail of gray smoke rising to the top of old grandmother from the case and the gash. Then Kester saw that the place where he had touched the thing had a handle on it that he hadn't noticed before. He grabbed the handle and picked the thing up. It felt light enough to carry, yet heavier than that at the same time. It wasn't bulky, but it seemed larger than he should have been able to lift easily. Except he could, and he did. He brought it up to the flat, grassy area closer to the house. "So what is it?" Rob asked, like it was a strange alien or a dinosaur. "I guess it's the lightning suitcase, or the thunders," Kester answered, like that was obvious enough. "Or maybe they just travel together." Rob looked back at the gash in the woods. "Well, they sure dropped it hard enough." Kester and Rob sat down in the grass on either side of the thing to look and to think. As they looked, the handle Kester had used seemed to fade into the top of the thing. "Never seen a suitcase do that before." Rob's voice trembled. "Me either," Kester whispered. Then there was a yellow glow on one side of the box. Kester reached out and wiped at it with his hand, taking some ash off and into his palm. The yellow glow began to form words. "Open here." Then a red button showed up, which must have been the here the yellow words were talking about. Kester pushed the button before really thinking about it. Now the yellow glow flashed, "Stand back, please." Kester stood up and took a step back. "Further back than that, please," the yellow asserted. So Kester took 2 giant steps back, and the yellow glow changed again. "You too, Robert. Please step back." "Hey, that thing knows my name." Rob looked spooked and stood up and moved back a little faster than he probably needed to. "Thank you both." The yellow letters now glowed and then faded so that the boys were not sure they had been there at all. And the box began to make noises. There was a sound like pennies dropping into a metal container. First just a couple pennies, slowly, but then lots of pennies faster. Next, the box whirred like a helicopter taking off, and before that finished, something like knives scraping against a sharpening stone began to scream. There were clicks like playing cards on bicycle spokes as the bicycle picked up speed going downhill. Finally, there was the sharp wheeze of something like a jet engine reversing its thrust. Things were happening now, too. The box opened up or collapsed out, and things began to reach from it. The box grew a shining wing out towards Rob, and glass and steel and something that looked like a living animal popped out toward old grandmother tree. This all went on for some time, and Rob and Kester looked on spellbound, not quite sure whether they wanted to take a step forward to get a better look or a step backward to stay out of the way. So they just stood froze in place. Something like a steam whistle cried, and the whole thing twisted around with a thump to reveal something that had to be a large door between Kester and Rob, who came together near it, out of a need to be together, in the face of whatever this was, more than anything else. A frame of blue pulsed and surrounded the door, which looked sort of like a golden glass that shone in the morning light so brightly that the boys couldn't see through it, although they tried. Then the gold and the blue faded, revealing an opening into the strange thing before them. "Welcome," came a warm voice that was not at all mechanical or robotic, but there was no one inside that they could see. "Don't be afraid." The voice nearly caressed them in empathy. "I am here to help you." The boys remained quiet, not quite sure what to do. "I know about your prayer, Kester." The voice seemed so close it was almost inside them. "What prayer?" Rob said accusingly, looking at his little brother. Kester apologized. "I prayed for a good change last night when the thunder struck." "That's right. Although you didn't say the words until this morning, yes?" "Yes." Kester didn't know whether to be terrified or intrigued. What else did the suitcase know? "I am here to help you find that good change." "Who are you? Where are you?" Rob allowed himself to bend forward and look inside a bit. "I am right here in front of you." "Are you invisible or something?" The voice laughed. "Do I look invisible?" "Well, there's nothing here but this thing." Rob was angry with what was beginning to feel like a game. If that person was really here to help them, then the least they could do is show up face to face. "I am Goombago Watsa," the voice asserted. "What?" both boys said in unison. "Goom bag Watsa." The boys looked at each other and shrugged. "Come inside." The entrance seemed to welcome them even more. Putting out his arm in front of Kester in protection, Rob challenged the voice. "How do we know you are safe?" "You can't know for sure. Sometimes you must risk when your heart calls you." "What does your heart say?" "I think you're safe." Kester walked toward the doorway. "Wait!" Rob was not convinced. "What are you? Why are you here?" "I am Goombagawatsa. I am here because you have lost your way." "We're not lost. We're in our own backyard," Kester and Rob asserted almost in unison. "Ah, yes, your backyard. But you are still lost, aren't you?" "Well, things have been hard since the divorce stuff." Kester spoke in a whisper. Rob just stood there. Goombagawatsa seemed to just wait for the boys to decide. Eventually, Kester stepped up to the doorway and peeked inside. There was a huge space beyond the doorway, much larger than seemed possible this side of the old tree. And there was a window that reached from the floor to the ceiling, with two large, comfortable-looking chairs facing into it, waiting somehow for Rob and Kester. The big arms of the chairs looking ready to hug them and welcome them. While the window looked like a window, it also was a screen of some kind, and as Kester looked at it, a diagrammatic map faded into being showing House A with a line to House B, and two more lines that seemed to circle out from the line between the two houses in all sorts of directions, and sometimes side by side and sometimes completely on their own. In a little box at the bottom of the diagram, there was a legend that simply said that the yellow line was Kester's journey and the blue line was Rob's journey. It was impossible to say just where the end of the journey was, or for with either the yellow or the blue lines, which somehow seemed a bit daunting to Kester as he stepped across the threshold to see a little better. Rob came up behind Kester as if something were chasing him. All of a sudden it seemed safer inside than out. Rob first noticed that the arm of his chair, how did he know it was his? Had a word, food, glowing on it. "Shall we begin?" the warm voice asked, waiting for their answer. "Begin what?" Kester was suddenly overcome with incredulity. That means he didn't quite believe it. "Begin your journey home, of course," Goombagawatsa said. "But we are home." Rob heard the half-heartedness in his answer even as he finished the sentence. "Home? Well, at Dad's house, it's sort of home." "Precisely." The Goombagawatsa seemed often to leave lots of quiet space for the boys to think and answer, which was a little spooky. "Well, we can't go anywhere without telling Dad we're going. He'll worry himself sick if we disappear." Rob thought that made good sense and might save them from a departure into who knows where. The warm voice soothed. "That's very thoughtful of you, Rob. But the journeys we will take are not like that. We will head out and be back at the same time. Your father will never miss you." "Huh?" Kester's face was tightened up into disbelief, and he began to feel like it might permanently change his expression. "You boys will return before you leave. The journeys we will take do not just happen in time or space. Your father will be fine. Come along. Let's begin." So that's the story to start us off. And I want to say that I think there are actually a lot more chairs in the Goombagawatsa, and one is yours. And that together we are going to travel places we have never been before and meet people from history, meet all kinds of interesting folks. And that the Goombagawatsa will help us because it's come to us in this time because we are dealing with the coronavirus and an epidemic. and school is not quite school, and everything is just a little messed up. It's not exactly horrible or sad, but it's not exactly good either. And the Goon Bag of Watts, I hope, is going to help us find the way. So, that's the story for today. You might just go out and look behind your house and see if you see a suitcase. Or sit on your bed and close your eyes and imagine going into the Goon Bag of Watsa and sitting down in your own chair and pushing that food button on the arm and see if it'll bring you your absolute favorite taste. I hope to see you all again soon. Meanwhile, God bless you.